Okay, welcome class. This is going to be our first lecture that corresponds to our PowerPoint slides here on Invitation to the Lifespan. This is going to be the science of lifespan development, and it's going to be based on Chapter 1 in the textbook that we're using. So what I'll be doing is I'll be posting these lectures that accompany the PowerPoint slides approximately on Monday of each week, so that you guys have a chance to do the pre-test and the mastery test by Sunday at noon. That's when the pre-tests are going to be due for each week, and those are going to be done in Development Portal, which hopefully everyone has registered for access to at this point and joined our class. So one of the first things that we started talking about in the discussion board was, in addition to introducing ourselves, talking about how to define development, and in particular what lifespan development really is. It's a branch of psychology. It studies, the process of how we change over time, and a lot of you hit on that in your attempt to define what lifespan development psychologists do. They really seek to understand how and why people change over time. And the goal of lifespan developmental psychologists is to try to identify what aspects of this change over time are related to these inborn changes that take place within the individual and that relate to age, as opposed to other things that also might change along with age but are not necessarily a result of the process of aging. And what I mean by this is, let's say that a specific event occurs at the time that you are 10 years old. It could be a traumatic event, it could be a really happy event, and it might change you. So that event is the cause of some change that takes place in you. It's not because you just turned 10 years old, but rather it's because of some external event. And so one of the goals of developmental psychologists is to try to identify the specific changes that take place as a result of the process of aging, as opposed to, as the example I just gave, some external events that are not due to age per se, but may be associated with age. In this case, you happen to turn 10 years old, and there happened to be a particular event that took place at that time in your life. So there are 5 basic steps to the scientific method, and this is generally covered in every psychology class at the very beginning, because psychology is, of course, a science, and we try to use scientific methods to understand the things that we're studying within psychology. So on the basis of theory or prior research or personal observation, the first step of the scientific method is to pose a question. Okay? And based upon some sort of question that we might have, our next step is to develop a hypothesis. This is a specific prediction that can be tested. And so I really want to emphasize that it's really a statement. It's not another question. It's a statement in the form of a specific prediction. And most importantly as well, it's also capable of being tested. That is, if I make this prediction, I should be able to test whether or not that prediction is true or not. And so, it's the testability of the hypothesis that really differentiates scientific hypotheses from non-scientific hypotheses. So in order to test this hypothesis, we need to design and conduct research in order to gather empirical evidence. Okay, the word empirical means based on observation. And so what we do is we let our observations serve as the basis of evidence. It's not what we think, per se. It's what we observe. Okay, that's what science is all about. It's about basing your conclusions off of your observations, off of data, rather than in philosophy, for instance, where you just sort of suppose, what might be going on. That's what really differentiates psychology from philosophy, is the fact that in psychology it's a scientific branch, and it uses observations and empirical evidence, which means just evidence based on observations, in order to test our hypotheses. And then, of course, on the basis of those observations, we then draw our conclusions. So we use this evidence to support or refute our hypothesis. Our hypotheses may be right or they may be wrong, and we let our observations determine which of those it is. And then, of course, the final step is, if we want this to be of any benefit to everyone, we need to report our results. And reporting our results usually is in the form of a publication in a scientific journal. So we report the results, share our data and conclusions, as well as alternative explanations for why we might have found what we found. Okay, there are certain debates that come up again in psychology quite frequently, and some of these are particularly relevant to developmental psychologists, one of which I'm sure you've all encountered before is the nature-nurture debate. Nature referring to the influence of genes that we inherit, nurture referring to environmental influences. These environmental influences could be anything in your environment: the health and diet of the embryo's mother, family, school, community, society, basically anything that an organism is exposed to is under this category of nurture here, because it's something from our environment. And it can be very difficult to try to differentiate the relative contribution of nature and nurture, because of the fact that oftentimes, when we look at how similar a child is to its parents, we've got the problem that, well, the child generally shares genes in common with the parents and shares an environment in common with the parents. So how can you tell whether it's shared genes or shared environment that makes them similar to one another? And there are ways to try to differentiate those two things, but it can be very difficult to do so. And so that's where this debate comes from. Another important aspect of developmental psychology is that there are often either critical or sensitive periods. Critical periods are times when certain things must occur for normal development. A similar concept is the concept of a sensitive period, which is when a particular event must occur, or I shouldn't say must occur. It's when a particular behavior is most suited to develop, although it's not as if it's an all or none thing, where if you don't develop a particular behavior during the sensitive period, it's not to say that it can't develop, it's just to say that it's not going to develop the same way, or perhaps the behavior won't develop as proficiently as it may have occurred during this sensitive period. So an example of a critical period, for instance, might be fetal exposure to testosterone, which results in a fetus becoming male rather than female. We're all females by default when an egg is initially fertilized by a sperm cell, and it's really exposure to androgens, particularly testosterone, during a specific period of embryological development that it's determined whether an organism will become a male or not. A sensitive period, on the other hand, might be, for example, the younger we are, the easier it is for us to learn different languages. So the later you wait to learn a language, if you're, say, 20 years old, it's much more difficult to learn a second language than, let's say, if you were 10 years old, for instance. So it's not to say that you can't learn that second language, but it's more difficult outside of that sensitive period, which is really prior to puberty.